Okay, so now let's look at how income and prices do affect your choice. So on the initial one, right, we have our budget constraint right here. Let's say our optimal choice was point M. And we did this by using our margin analysis, right? Margin to divided by price for both goods. And this consumer decided that point M gives them the most utility. Now, if we had an increase in income, we now have a new budget constraint because now we can afford more of both goods. Now we have to do our margin analysis again. Now, what's interesting here is now it's possible we can pick P, N, and Q, just as an example. All right. Now, if we were to pick point N, what happened there? Well, we were at three overnight stays and 8 tickets. But if we pick point N, we are now at 5 overnight stays and 20 tickets. So what happened to the tickets? The amount of tickets increased and the overnight stays increased as well. So what can we say about tickets and overnight stays in this case? Your income increased and you bought more. So in both of these cases, normal goods for the overnight stays and the tickets because you're buying more of both. What if we were to pick point P? Now, what's special about point P is you are buying more tickets, right? But you are buying less overnight stays. So in this case, we would say that the overnight stays are an inferior good. That is a possibility. The consumer got more money, but then they bought less of the overnight stays. So that is your inferior good. Point Q goes the opposite way. Now you're actually buying less tickets, but you are buying more overnight stays. Maybe this consumer really loves the town that they're staying in, but they were okay with the tickets. So they're going to buy less tickets and more overnight stays because they want to experience that better. And so what we'll see here is that the tickets, in this case, because you're buying less of those are your inferior good if this consumer picked point Q. All right? So this is how we can determine normal or inferior goods, because based off of point M, where they started and where they're ending, are they buying more or less? Okay, that's how we can determine normal or inferior goods. Now, prices can also change the budget constraint. So let's say point M is your optimal choice for baseball bats and cameras. If the price of a baseball bat does increase, all right, this does not change your ability to purchase cameras, all right? Like right here, the optimal or the most amount of cameras you can buy stays the same, all right? So we do not change the point on the axis because the price of the baseball bats changes, but because they are more expensive, you do shift in the budget constraint on how many baseball bats they can buy. Okay, so this is how price changes your budget constraint. Notice it doesn't move it for both goods like the income does, but price does affect how many bats you are going to buy. However, the amount of baseball bats and cameras could change for the two reasons, right? So now we have H, J, K, and L as possible choices for cameras and bats. Okay, so related to point M, right? What does H, J, K, and L say about these two goods? Now, the reason these change is because of the two reasons, income effect and the substitution effect. I'll show you how these work simultaneously. So typically, higher prices will lead to the consumer buying less of that good. So the reason is because of these two things. The substitution effect says you are now consuming less of one good and then buying another one because it's cheaper. So in this case, because bats are more expensive, you buy less bats, but now you're like, oh, let me just buy more cameras. So I'm substituting. That's why you're buying less bats, is because you're substituting for the other one. The other reason is the income effect, which says higher prices reduce your buying power, so you buy less. On this one, you're buying less bats because they're more expensive, but also because they're more expensive, it's lowering your purchasing power, so it lowers your income in a way. So now you have less money, you're buying less cameras and less bats. That's what the income effect says. So both of these are happening simultaneously. Now, depending on if you buy more or less cameras, will show us if the substitution effect is stronger or the income effect is stronger. I'll show you what we mean in a second. Okay? So if the price of a bat increases, you're buying less bats and more cameras. So on this one, let's say you're going from M to H. So you are buying less bats, that is true, but you are buying more cameras. See how we are substituting the bats for the cameras. So in this case, the substitution effect is stronger for this good. That's why we're having more cameras here. Now, if you do buy less bats and less cameras, so now you're at point J, then we would say the income effect is stronger than the substitution effect. This one says because the prices are higher, it's kind of like your income is lower. And so because your purchasing power is lower and you buy less of something, that is the income effect. And so because this is happening, what kind of goods are that? That's a normal good. You have less money, so you buy less of them. So if you're not at H and you are at point J, this means that the income effect is stronger than the substitution effect because you're buying less of both, and both are normal goods. Okay? If you're buying more bats and less cameras, what this is saying is that the income effect is larger and that baseball bat's an inferior good. Okay? Again, prices are higher, so your purchasing power is lower, but then you buy more of something. This indicates an inferior good. So it kind of seems counterintuitive here, but that's what's showing us here, that the income effect is larger. This does have a name. Whenever you break the law of demand says higher prices, lower quantity. So whenever you break the law of demand, that is called a Giffen good. We have experienced Giffen goods in the past, things like rice, where basically consumers, even though the price was higher, they bought more of it because they didn't want the price to be even higher. And so what we saw was because prices were higher, people still bought more. And so those are called Giffen goods. All right. So this is what we're talking about of why the quantities are changing for both goods. All right. It could be because the income effect, where prices are higher, so you could buy less or more because of the changing purchasing power. Or it could be the substitution effect, which says because that's more expensive, you substitute for the other good. Again, both are happening at the same time. Depending on which one is stronger, shows us what's going to happen to our optimal choice. In the next video, we'll talk about behavioral economics, which shows us how people respond to these types of situations.